Are live. Let me just make sure my volume's not on the actual channel. All right. Yep, we are live. Hey everyone, how are you all doing tonight? It's been at least a little bit. I think I took a break last week because it was last week. I actually don't remember if it was last week. Snowflakes. No, it was 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I was doing that. But we have Benn Stancil here, co-founder of Mode, chief analytics officer, and then also just all around. You just write a ton of stuff on data. When it's out there, right? I mean, is there anything else that you usually describe yourself as?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, mostly just like kind of cranky old man on the internet these days.
I've heard a lot of people who've been in data, probably not that much longer than me, but long enough to where they've just described themselves as like, I'm just a grumpy old person in data. Like that's where I'm at. I'm like, thanks. Is this what I get to look forward to in like 5 years, 10 years? Like, is that what happens?
I've like always been kind of a cranky old man, so you might have some hope. That's sort of been like I was in a 7th grade play. I was cast as Scrooge, and I think I just like have carried that with me ever since. So
nice, just same energy throughout the whole time.
It was typecast.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're not being grumpy and working in data and running Mode to some degree, like what are you doing?
So I live in New York. I do New York things. Kind of, especially now, the city's like back open. You kind of wander around and do things. I play baseball. I play like my like main hobby that I spend a bunch of time on is playing baseball. Go Braves. Yeah, I like to play baseball my whole life. Playing like adult leagues and things like that. Hanging on to being able to keep doing that until my arm falls off.
Nice. Yeah. Until you like tear something. Do you pitch or where do you? Okay. Yeah. So you're gonna tear something at some point.
Yeah, for sure. I like everybody goes at some point. Everybody has their like, I should go get Tommy John, but I'm way too old for that. And why am I doing this anymore for rec league stuff? So that's what I'm waiting on. Until that happens, though, I'll keep trying.
Yes. Oh, just to add to your whatever grumpy old man. Someone said Bill Inman is the quintessential grumpy old man in data.
That's going to be a tough one to beat. So yeah, give me 30 years, I guess, but we'll see.
Yeah, give you 30 years. I think he's out here in Denver. I was talking to Joe Rays about him. It sounded like he was more like the Yoda or something, where he just like something of that nature. But yes,
people make their treks out to see him and
pay their respect. They're homage, yes. I guess the question next after like what do you do when you're not doing data? How did you get into data? Because data is one of those things where it's like it's not like software engineering and you like go straight to software engineering. I feel like people tend to fall into data somehow.
Yeah, I was more or less the same. So I did like math and econ in college, somewhat by accident. I did it mostly because I went to a liberal arts school. We were required to take a bunch of science classes. I did not want to take anything with labs because everybody said labs were terrible. So I tried to avoid those. And I hated writing papers. I wanted to avoid writing papers, like anything to do with writing anything, which kind of is ironic to get now.
Yeah, actually.
I'm not sure what happened. But so I basically was like, oh, math seems good. Econ was kind of interesting. So I did that. After school, I ended up working in a think tank in DC for a couple of years, which actually is kind of like a analyst job a little bit, except you don't get that your clients aren't paying you. And nobody really listens to you. So basically a think tank is like this bridge between policy and academia, where in theory, the kind of concept is, okay, you're trying to figure out what policies do we pass for, such and such social program type of thing. A think tank does a bunch of research kind of based on what academic research people are doing and then makes these recommendations saying, hey, here's what we think we should do. I was working in that shortly after the financial crisis in 2008. In DC, we were making a bunch of recommendations about like what the Fed should be doing. The Fed did not care what we thought they should be doing. But I enjoyed the work where it was, here's a problem. It's kind of ambiguous. Use some data to figure out what you think you're going to do. Make some recommendation on it. It's frustrating that you're 7 steps removed from anything happening. But it was like that thought process was sort of interesting. And so I ended up, think tanks are these sort of weird institutions where there's everybody in it either right out of college and basically using it as a stepping stone to grad school, or they are people on the cusp of retirement. It's a bunch of Bill Inmans who are like basically getting paid a fat salary to kind of like rub around elbows with their friends and kind of pontificate from their soapboxes. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to immediately become one of those people, so I have to go get another job. And so I ended up looking around for other things. I had a friend who actually had a connection to a job in San Francisco that was like a data job. The title of the job was a quantitative product analyst. I had no idea what that was. I had no idea what the company did. I had no idea what SQL was. I didn't know any of these things. But it was like a data job that when I went to the office, it was like, this seems like a world different than DC.
Yeah.
And so I ended up in that job. And that was like an analyst. It was basically a data analyst job, and kind of the modern incarnation of, we have a business problem, help us figure out what to do about it. And so I enjoyed that work, and then kind of it's all sort of come out of that. But yeah, it was a semi-accidental path in terms of like, the job I got out of college at the think tank was 2009. Nobody was hiring. It was the only job I got. The job I got at Yammer, which was the company I joined, was the only job I got. It was basically me walking through the doors that were open.
Wow. So you were possibly rubbing elbows with David Sachs, possibly.
Yes. Sachs was the CEO of Yammer. This was back before he became a famous Twitter personality.
Twitter, all in podcast, whatever.
Yeah, whatever he is now.
Everything. What was it? You mentioned what do you call it? Like the Fed earlier, and all this, like, and them ignoring you, and all I was thinking about is like, I feel like, especially like, like, I don't think I started paying attention to that kind of stuff until 2014, 2015, just based on age and where I was. But I was like, it just feels like we know things are going to happen. Like, let's say inflation, like we knew it was going to happen, but we all just kind of stared at it like, oh no, for like 6 months. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I was just like, and there was a few other things like the Ukraine war, like we all knew it was going to happen. We kind of just all stared at it like, oh no, it's going to happen. And I was like, does anyone have control in this world? Or are we all just kind of like hoping things don't happen? Is that our current strategy?
The econ thing is like, I pay like a fair amount of attention to that. Like I did then very much. And it was interesting. And so I kind of like do now. That one, the inflation thing was like, some people sort of, that was less of a sure thing, at least. There were some smart people who I think were like, maybe it won't. If it does, it'll be temporary. Obviously, it didn't really work out that way. Still kind of saying it's not going to be so bad. And there's certain things that are like sort of long-term expectations of inflation that are kind of supposed to be back to normal. We'll see. And I think to some extent there was certainly like an overconfidence in basically the degree to which the Fed is able to moderate things. Of sort of like, hey, we haven't had this problem for a long time. We figured it out. Well, maybe.
Yeah.
The Ukraine thing, I genuinely don't get. The Ukraine thing seems like everybody was just like, it's like, they're building up, and it's like, what do you think they're going to do? I guess actually there was like enough response there that people were aware of it, but it does sort of seem like this got pretty well telegraphed. Seems like we shouldn't be surprised, but we all kind of seem surprised.
Yeah. So, and there was a few other things like that this year where it was just like, it seems like we all knew it was coming, but we just all stared at it. But, this is not meant to be politics, and I don't want to bring people that way. But benefit, someone here says, hey, love your newsletter. So I'm sure you've got plenty of people who are in the.
There's a lot of people who can't sleep at night, clearly, and need something to help put them to sleep. Yeah.
Someone was asking, though, like, so.
But I appreciate it.
Someone asked me prior to this chat, is like, so do you think Ben has a ghostwriter, or do you think he just has an amazing sense of humor? So like a humor that most people can't have. And so I think based on this conversation thus far, I think that's just maybe your perspective.
So the one thing I'll say, so like the writing thing, all I can figure is I hated it in college. Absolutely hated it. Wanted nothing to do with it. Like it was dreaded it. I think with this, what I at least started doing was I basically started just writing it to entertain myself. It was like, well, at least I'm going to do something that I think is fun. Whether or not it's anybody else thinks that, I guess. But yeah, like there were a lot of things that would not have made the college papers that are like, you know what? This joke is kind of a weird reference to like a 1999 stand-up special that I really like. It's going to make it in. So yeah, there's not a ghostwriter, but there's also no editor, which is probably the bigger problem. That's probably what it really needs.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that pain. When I'm writing, I'm just like, I just kind of like shoot at things and then hopefully it's not terrible. Then I read again The Pragmatic Engineer, and I'm like, oh man, I need to like spend like this much time writing my articles.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've probably, I think, come across some of his pieces.
There are some that you finish and you're like, this is pretty good, and I put in an amount of time and I feel good about it. There are some that you're just like shotgunning across the line on a Friday afternoon, and you're like, oh God. You're sick of reading it by then. You're like, I don't know if there's any good or not, but deadlines are deadlines. So yeah, there are some that that land kind of on fire.
Yeah. No, I totally feel that. I think, well, your last one prior to obviously the recent kind of the last one prior to the last one, it was about Snowflake. Did you feel like there was anything else that you would have liked to kind of discuss that you kind of picked up from Snowflake Summit?
I mean, the thing that this was like that one was one that very much landed on fire. But
I think a lot of people liked it. So
it was, the thing that I like, the piece of it that didn't really make it in that I kind of wanted to, and it did, but like not in a good enough way. The thing that was like the really big takeaway, the other kind of broader takeaway, even kind of bigger than the sort of app stuff, is like the degree of which Snowflake is ambitious. And I think that was the thing, honestly, that struck me the most in this whole thing. Is I went into it expecting it to be like, all right, Snowflake, okay, be next Oracle. By be next Oracle, I mean build a bunch of databases. The whole transactional thing was kind of predictable. And in some ways that fits that, like, what is it? Well, it's just another database. Great. But there was this whole kind of undertone to it that's like, this thing isn't even a database anymore. Like, I don't even know what this is. Where is it? It's this sort of multifaceted thing that's basically like a platform. You put everything in, and then it's got all these different interfaces into it, and it starts to get to the point where it's like, well, what is it? Where's the data live? Well, the data lives in your random Parquet files and someone else's S3 bucket. Well, what do you use to query it? Well, you can use SQL, but you can use these other things too. What does the data platform itself do? Well, it's a bunch of like security protocols built on top of it. It's like there's enough there where you're kind of like, it starts to feel more like a cloud provider than a database. And I think I don't know exactly where that goes. You know, you can certainly sort of like extrapolate some things out of potentially what they want it to be. But, you know, everybody says like Slootman's a killer and Slootman wants this thing to be huge and Slootman wants the Snowflake Summit to be the next Dreamforce. And part of it's like everybody's sort of obligated to say that, especially when you're the CEO of a public company, and that's like what you got to say. But there was also part of that that's like, this guy might mean it. And like he might be willing to sort of do the things that it takes to get there. Which again, I think, especially if you look around at some of the other like database vendors, you don't see that. Like you don't see that from BigQuery. You don't see it from Google, even though I think Google should be doing it. Redshift seems to be content to just slowly die. And Databricks actually seems like sort of ambitious, but Databricks seems like it's caught between like cultures of sorts. I don't know anything about Databricks, but I mean, but like Databricks seems like it's transitioning away from sort of its original Spark lineage into also being a bunch of ruthless people who want to build an enormous business.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true with like, and I think what's interesting is like when I do go into like Databricks, it's like you can tell who built what or like what their origin was. Like I go into Databricks, I'm like, this feels like this was built for data scientists. Like let's take a bunch of notebooks and like create them into jobs, and then like, but everything's focused around the notebook, which you know, if you like, I always kind of tease my girlfriend who's in data science that like the only tool that data scientists really love is notebooks, and that's like their only tool, right? Like they and a bunch of stats, but like other than that, it's like notebook. For data engineers, we're stuck with like a gajillion tools. It's like, which tool would you like today? Like you've got like 20 different data storage options. You've got like 50 different ETL tools. Like, but for them, it's like, we're going to keep using the notebook and everything's going to be focused around the notebook. I don't know if you feel that way, but that's just kind of.
I mean, it does seem like there was, and it feels like there is there's like the cities that get built on top of other cities where it's like you look underneath it and there's like ruins. I don't know if this actually exists. I assume this exists.
Yeah, Seattle.
I feel okay. Yeah, I feel like I've heard of this before.
Yeah, Seattle.
But it feels sort of like walking through Databricks is like walking through a version of that, where there is like sort of the city underneath that was the original, like very Spark heavy kind of academic data science type of thing, all these sort of notebook orientation. And then they have slowly built a new kind of city on top that is like, no, this is an enterprise product that's going to make a whole bunch of money. And it does sort of seem like there's these sort of two eras in the way that company has existed. Obviously, like very successful and stuff like that, but it seems like they're moving from, we will be the next Cloudera to we want to be the next Oracle again, which those are obviously two very, very different businesses. Like Cloudera, you know, did well, good for them, but like that seems like it has a ceiling. Whereas those other things seem like they're going for something much bigger. And I feel like Databricks sort of woke up to this and the possibility of how big it could be I mean, I think they're always aware of it could be very big, but I think they woke up to the possibility of it being like a sort of generational company as opposed to an IPO scale company. It seems like over the last few years.
Yeah.
That could be totally wrong. Maybe that's always been the vision and stuff, but I obviously have no inside scoop here.
Yeah, I think it's all. You can only kind of guess a little bit from the outside. We'll see what their summit has. Like I'm sure they'll have their fair share of announcements. But yeah, like you bring up Cloudera, and it is just so hard to tell where data is going because 5 years ago Cloudera was where data was going, right? Like it's like that's where data was, and now we're like, nah, forget that. To some degree, I mean, some companies are still using it. They're a successful company in their own right. But yeah, now it's like, where's data going? I don't know if maybe it felt, I'd love to know, did you feel like it felt this ambiguous 5 years ago? Or did you feel like it was a little more clear cut? Because like today, I'd say it feels like there's so many options. It feels less clear on where data, like data infrastructure is going in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I think probably it feels like it's been through sort of 3 phases. And so Mode's been around for a long time.
Yes.
Mode's been around since 2013. The beginning of it was basically like, what are y'all doing? Like the beginning of it was a lot of people really seemingly very skeptical of 2 things. Very skeptical of like data in the cloud is not going to work. Or if it is, it's like not going to be, people aren't going to really be that comfortable with it. And there it wasn't like outright data in the cloud will never work, but it was this kind of, can the scale of it work? Can you really make this stuff? Like, is that actually going to be a thing? So there's some resistance to that. The other thing was there was a kind of, wasn't really a resistance, but a lot of confusion over who was going to use this stuff. That it was like the sort of data team as it exists today was not really a thing. It was in some companies. Like there's a team that I worked on at Yammer. It was a team that a lot of tech companies had. But sort of beyond that, there weren't a lot of people who had these kind of like data teams that weren't either BI teams or sort of data scientist teams of like statisticians sitting in a closet trying to solve like math problems.
Yeah.
And so both of those things were kind of like, okay, I can kind of see it, but maybe not. And that's also the point where like the sort of capital D data science ecosystem was that was the future of data, was all we're going to predict everything and all that. It seems like that transitioned in basically the middle of the decade, 2015, 2016 to 2019-ish into, this is going to be a real thing. There's going to be this fairly structured pattern around it. It's going to be like the 4 kind of pillars of the stack where you're going to have your like ETL and you're going to have a warehouse and you're going to have an analytics tool and then like something like DBT. All that stuff seemed like fairly solidified. It was like, okay, we have a fairly simple structure here that we're going to have. And everybody's going to eventually follow the same thing. It's going to be like a kind of standard migration to the cloud in this paradigm. Probably 2019, 2020, especially when like the funding market just went bananas for 18 months.
Yeah.
And every data person decided to start a data company, which I think there's some reasons for that. That's the point at which it was all just like, all right, now it's chaos. Now there's a new space that's starting up every 6 months or every 2 months. There's a company like, YC is half data companies. That became a place where the whole thing became very unsettled. And I don't know that actually like the real trajectory of the industry became that unsettled, to be honest. And in some ways, like you see this with Snowflake. Well, what is Snowflake? Snowflake's a big basic database. And yeah, they're changing to something else, but like it was successful partly because it was just like, it's a big database. Yeah. And so I think like, and like DBT is successful because it's SQL and like, it's not a fancy thing. And so I think there is some, like, we have stayed on the path, but there's been so much noise around it. It's a little bit hard to see, like the path probably never really changed that much.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe it is entirely possible that there are things that emerge out of this that are genuinely different and unexpected. I don't really think that's happened yet, though, maybe like something like Snowflake or that kind of thing probably changes that potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. What were your thoughts on the VC point? Because you're like, I have some thoughts on that. What were you?
So the data thing is, it's like, why did all these data people start a company? Like where did that come from? And I think it's partly like the fundraising thing. It was just easy. I am a senior data person at random startup or like somewhat successful company. I can go out and immediately raise money. And like, that's what we did. Like, I just can't discredit that. Like, that's
Sure.
2013, we came out of an acquisition and we were people who had no business doing that. And Silicon Valley, like, here's a bunch of money. I think the other part of it, though, that I think is a little bit more interesting is data people don't have a career path. Like, where do you go? You know, say you're not me. So I was like random analyst who'd been working in tech for a year, and I'm like, I'm gonna start a company. So that's like kind of dumb. But say that you're someone who actually is like, you're a VP of data, or you're a senior director, or you're somebody who's running a team that your boss is not a data person, which is pretty common.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do next? Like, you basically bounce around to a bunch of other jobs that look like that. That it's this sort of cap. And I have like some friends who are like this, who like hit this kind of ceiling where they just are on this like rotation of different jobs that are all kind of the same. It's like you try to find a startup that might be a little bit more successful. You maybe join a little bit earlier. Maybe you join something a little later that has potential to be really big. But like, it's all kind of the same job. And everybody's like, you know, they want to be making the decisions. They want to be in the room. They want to be in charge. They want to see it earlier, all that stuff. And so I think like almost the inevitable thing you have to do as a data person is start a company, because you're not going to be hired as like the fifth person. Like, you can't go really early.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this draw of like, this is the next career step in a lot of ways. It's the place where I can actually be the person who's in the room, because otherwise I'm going to be kind of relegated to being permanently like one step outside of the door.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, because like after that, there's some CDO positions maybe, but is that what you want to do? You know, yeah, and those are only at certain companies, right? It's not going to be at a startup. There's not a lot of room for a CDO.
Yeah. And like CDOs are I don't know. I feel like the startup persona, like a CDO is almost like an IT person in a lot of companies, and it's like I can see the startup people being like, that's not. I don't want to be the person who's responsible for our like enterprise data governance strategy, you know.
Yeah.
So.
What do you got against data governance? No, I'm kidding. No, I mean, like, it's very different, obviously, working at a large organization versus working at a small company where it's like data governance. I mean,
data governance is like keep the database credentials in one password instead of on your laptop, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it's something that's very doesn't seem like actual data governance, because it's like we do not have the budget to, you know, spend a year just to plan that whole strategy out there. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So like bringing this back down to people who probably, you know, are not all at the VP level, like thinking about like, you know, starting careers again. How do you recommend people kind of get their first job in data? Because I think it's also always interesting how people get there.
I mean, there's like so many different ways in. I think I can tell you the answers of like what it is that we look for when we hire folks, and like the places I've seen people be successful. So one is like, and it depends on kind of where you are in your career too. Like if you're, you know, someone who has some experience and looking to get into it, it's a little bit different. But say you're like someone right out of college. The people I've seen that have done this really well are often people who don't work in data initially. Like there are some companies that will hire entry level data people out of school or you know, without much experience. It's a little tough. Partly because there's like so many kind of people now that are trying to chase that. But I've seen a lot of people who basically like find places that they can be adjacent to it. And then there are so many data problems and things that you can do to start demonstrating that. It's like pretty easy to, even if you don't like make the step in that same company, to pick up a lot of those things and be able to do it. Like if you know, can learn a little bit of SQL on the job type of stuff. It's kind of like the way that people get into PMs. So a lot of PMs don't start as PMs, but like start as something sort of adjacent, and like they want to become a PM. So they like start to pick up some of that stuff. I feel like that's a pretty common thing for folks I've seen is they will have a job. Like I know somebody who was like worked as like a support analyst, basically, where it was an analyst, but it was kind of on the like, help us just do some like kind of basic reporting on support tickets. It was very much outside of kind of the core team. Yeah. But there's tons of opportunity in that where like they're kind of expecting someone to just like build charts. And if you're like, I actually had these problems, I wanted to dig into it. Even if you don't know like SQL or Python or whatever, and you're just like, I'm just doing it in Excel, and I like try to uncover these things. I think that goes a really long way. And like there are so many places where if you have that ability, people will be like, oh, you should do more of these things. There's like tons, like data teams are so overloaded that anybody who can help with that, they will be like immediately thrilled to have being involved. The other thing that I think is like this is the answer I sort of hate giving. I think it's true, but I kind of hate giving it. one of the things whenever we look for folks, kind of regardless of the level they are, that's always very exciting to see on like resumes is people who have what amounts to a portfolio. That data, you can do plenty of like data projects outside of your job. And it doesn't mean like, that's not like I took a class and learned pandas. That's like, there was a question that I wanted to answer. And so I wrote a blog post trying to answer this question. And it could be like, you found a bunch of data sets on some place on the internet, you downloaded them to Excel, and then you make charts in Excel. Like, that's what I did in my job in DC. Literally, all I did was like download data sets from the World Bank in Excel and like made stuff with them.
Yeah.
But that, to me, like the thing that makes the best analysts and the best data people aren't their technical ability. It's basically how do we reason about data and like how do you think about problems that are kind of ambiguous. And if you have these problems that you're interested in, that could just be random stuff. Like back in the early days of Mode, there was a blog that we had a Mode blog that was kind of this me talking about random stuff, like very random stuff. Like the first blog post is about Miley Cyrus. Like it's weird. But there was like this question I had of if you ever been in San Francisco, there's driveways everywhere, and it leaves all these half parking spots. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world that you're trying to find a parking spot, and it's like a thing that's a 3/4 car length. You can never park in. You're like, how this is awful. And so it basically was like, how many parking spots do we waste by these? Like, how many parking spots do we have if we just like arrange the driveways better? And so like did a thing about that, and like it was a problem that I was genuinely interested in. Like the reason I did it was because I was like, I kind of want to know the answer to this question. And so there's a lot of things like that. If you find the things like you genuinely want to know the answer to and just do it, like that to me is the sort of thing that is the best thing to see on a resume is just someone who's already done that. And like, the reason I don't like that answer is there's like plenty of reasons why there's bias in that. And like, people who have the time to do it and stuff like that. And I very much understand that. But it's sort of like a designer portfolio, or like people with designers who have a portfolio you look at and you're like, oh, wow, this person, they care about it. They're really excited about it. They have all these things. You can see like how their work is. You can see that they're curious about what the work is that they're doing. To the extent that analysts can create that, I think that's like, I don't know. It's a very, very compelling thing to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another thing that I really liked about that was like, you found the idea. And I think, cause like some people ask me like, well, what, like, make some more project videos, which I need to do, but they take a long time. But part of me is just like, I mean, part of it is you just need the framework. Like, here's a few tools. Ask a question that you are curious about, because there's a data set somewhere that probably exists. Did you find a data set somewhere that existed about, or did you just kind of guess it and like, you're like, this is how I would do it?
The parking space one I kind of, so the Miley Cyrus one, I ended up like, there's the thing about Miley Cyrus was about like the VMAs, and I think it was around the time of the like Can't Stop, Won't Stop video, which was everybody hated for some reason. So it was like, I think I like went to a bunch of YouTube videos and like hand wrote down like the number of likes that like 50 videos had. And so it's like, that was the level of it. The parking spot one was, it was like a Python script. I wrote a thing that was essentially estimating, okay, there's this many blocks of this many length. If you like randomly put driveways on it and you space out the houses a certain way, how many like partial spots do you create? Okay, what if you like did it smarter? How many? It was like a little mini script that probably was entirely wrong. But nobody knows that.
Exactly, no one can prove it.
But like, but you can certainly find this stuff. I mean, like and in some ways that's like the right way to learn it, because in the course of writing this blog, when I first started it, I knew SQL. That was it. And I like learned some Python to do this bit about the driving ways. I started realizing I wanted to like scrape data. The reason I wanted to do this, there was a website that people could put in how much it cost when they bought weed. And I wanted to figure out which state had the most expensive weed. And I had to scrape it. And so I like learned like beautiful soup and stuff to be able to do that. And I like wanted to make a map of it. And so I like tried to learn a little bit like D3 to do that. And like, they were projects that would have been terrible if it was just like, here is a tutorial from a class where you like copy and paste stuff.
Sure.
But I was trying to build something I wanted this map. I like wanted to see the thing on a map. And that was the only way I knew how to get it. And so there's a certain like, you just sort of push yourself through those things because you care about the output. Like you're not trying to learn the skill, you're trying to create the map. And it's a much more fun way. I think you come out of it having learned a lot, but like it's a much more fun way of learning it than, oh, look, I have a certificate from Udemy. that says I can successfully kind of copy and paste some stuff.
Yeah, I think that's always the hard thing with and like I found the same thing, right? Like it's like sometimes like I really want to learn something. And it's like, I've tried the Udemy route occasionally. It's just like it'll never be the same as much as like I really want to solve this problem, or I have to solve this problem for work. That will definitely kick your brain into gear and be like, I need to focus on this problem.
Yeah, and the other thing, like on the data stuff in particular, the thing that I think is honestly the thing that's probably best about it is you push yourself, you go further. Like you create the map and you're like, oh wait, this map's kind of interesting, but also on the price of weed thing, there was a thing. This is actually true. The price of weed data included like the quality of the weed, and you're like, I could create another map that helps see if like which places are like the highest quality cheap weed. And like you start to be like these new things that you want to do because you're like interested in the problem, and so it's like you push a lot further than you would have if like you're just trying to get to the point of the answer in the back of the book.
That all jives, I think. What's the like? Well, I guess one question that I'm usually curious that most people have, and you kind of discussed about growth in data. So I guess when there's this like limitation, how do you recommend people kind of grow in data, or like what's kind of the path that you see for people trying to grow in data?
I think like on the earlier end, if you're on the more junior side, or just like you're basically not in the sort of management levels. Which sometimes I see is like management doesn't necessarily mean like you are a manager of people, but in sort of that, the junior versus senior side. I mean, I think a lot of it comes from, in some ways, the thing I was just saying, of like trying to figure out why people are asking questions and pushing beyond the thing that you get asked. Like, and you get asked so many questions as a data person that aren't the thing that people want to know.
Yeah.
Like people all the time ask you a thing that sort of 3 steps past what it is they actually wanted to know. And I think you can go like so much further with it by basically just trying to figure out what it is they want to know. And that requires you to do a couple of things. It requires you to like understand the context of the business. It requires you to understand kind of where the question is coming from. It requires you to kind of put yourself in a little bit of the deep end of here's a problem that I probably don't fully understand, but I'm trying to solve it. Like the people who, the best moments to me, like the sort of moments that you're like, you want as an analyst, or you have like a deck that you've put together and you're like, here's a slide, here's a slide, here's a slide. And someone stops you on one slide and is like, wait a minute. Okay, show me this and show me this. What about this other thing? And you're like, let me go to the next slide and that's going to answer it. Yeah. And you can like kind of figure what those out. You can kind of anticipate, like you see something, you're like, what questions you have of it. Okay, go figure out what questions you have and answer it. And I think like that sort of thing where it's look at the thing you're creating and be like, I need to not think about what is it the person's asking me. I'm trying to think about like, what is it that I'm looking at and what do I want to know from this? Yeah. And so that's where once you start to do that, then people will start to see you as like, oh, you're not here being the person who's just like writing queries for me or making charts. You're the person who's actually trying to solve the same business problem I am. I want to invite you in the room where those business problems are talked about, not where the data is presented. Yeah. And so I think like and once you get there, then you start to see much more interesting things where you're not putting together the pitch deck. You're talking about the strategy behind why the pitch deck is what it is and how you want to position the company. And like, you are the person who's like, hell, help us paint this picture, but you're there to be someone to design the whole strategy, not to be someone who's just like, we need a chart that looks up and to the right. We need a 2x2 grid with our logo and color in the corner.
Yeah.
So I think for that, for the people who are more senior, like it's tough. I guess the thing I would actually say is, and I am not good at this. Like, this is a do as I say, not as I do. Is it's like figure out what you actually are chasing. I think it's really easy, especially in startups where there's a lot of this kind of like exuberant growth, and it feels like everybody's starting a company and everybody's at some company that's valued in $1 trillion, and like it feels like the thing to chase is in some ways just like, okay, what's the next title? People get promoted really quickly. That kind of thing. And so the companies grow underneath people quickly. I feel like there's like a real kind of moment at that point. It's like pause and like, what is it that you actually enjoy? Do you find satisfaction in managing people? Do you find satisfaction in like doing data problems? Do you find satisfaction in kind of being an engineer? Like, there's a lot of people I think who end up in management positions who have no interest in being managers. They have interest in titles. And I think data people can end up like that too, where it's like, I don't actually care about these things, but this is the next step. And it's tricky because like, what if you don't want to do that step? What do you do next? It's harder to find that, but I do think it's like, it comes a point where you have to realize like what actually it is that you're chasing.
Yeah, I think there was kind of a like working at Facebook. There was like a difficulty of like even like a high like we'd have like a high like IC8 or IC7 for data engineering. It was always like, well, what does that mean? Like it's a lot harder to define, I think, that than maybe on the software side where it's like we're building a product and like you're defining a lot of that product and things like that. On the software side, like, and you're kind of acting almost like as a director or an owner of this product, and it's very clear. Whereas like with a data engineer, it's like, what does this mean, right? Or even an analyst, right? Like, what does it mean that you're high level? Obviously, I think part of it, like you said, is being invited in the room, which I think for some people maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I'd love to like hear some color on what you think like as the room is and like how people should get there. Because I think a lot of people again in the space look for like another technical skill, and I think there are other skills that you kind of have to like pick up to get into said room.
Yeah, I mean, so the room to me is, I mean, there's always a more inner room.
Yes.
But the room is basically like, essentially people get progressively more honest. It's the point in the company when people will say like scarier and scarier shit. Like to the entire company, everything's falling apart. It's like, it's an opportunity for growth. To the CEO and the CTO, and that's it. That conversation is like, we're done. Like there's a lot of rooms in between that where it's like, how sort of honest are people? Not like, I mean, people are on like, the company won't hear like everything's great and rosy, but like there certainly are conversations where it's like, all right, we need to really talk about this problem, and ultimately we're the ones making the decision about what to do about it. And for the most part, I think people want to be, you always kind of want to know what's going on in the room that you can't get in.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think like that, again, the thing that I think gets you in it is proving that you, one, can handle it, and two, that you, because like, I mean, and this is mostly not, I think this is mostly the problem with the people inside the inner room, not trusting the people out of it, sort of assuming like they can't handle it, but most people can. But I think to some extent it is that, and to some extent it is like, what are you going to contribute to that? Like, do you think about the problem in the same way? If someone asks you, I need a chart of X, and you give them the chart of X and never sort of figure out why they're asking for it, like they're not going to invite you into the room to figure out what to do with that chart. Like, as far as they can tell, what you did is you created a chart. And so it's like, no, you created the chart, but you also saw what the problem was. You're like, I got you the chart you thought you wanted, but I also got this chart that you actually want because it's the other thing. Yeah. That's the point at which people are like, well, you know what, actually, maybe like follow me and we should talk about this more. That to me is, if you want to do that, that's kind of the way in. And like data people have, I think, an easy way in some ways because they're trusted to work on these problems. Like if you are a sales rep, it's very hard to get in the room. No matter how good of a sales rep you are seen as like a talented sales rep. You're not necessarily seen as the person who we need to talk about to, what should our marketing strategy be? Whereas if you're a data person, you're sort of inherently in that problem in some way. It's sort of just up to you. And then it's also like to the degree of which the people above you trust you and like are trusting at all. But to be able to kind of like inject yourself in the higher level parts of this conversation.
Yeah. All I could think of when you were saying like more and more honest conversations was I don't remember if it was Lehman Brothers or the Bear Stearns CEO being on like whatever CNBC and like the day before it went under, and him being like, "It's great, it's fine." And it's like, bro knew it was not fine, but at the same time, like you said earlier, like you have to tell everyone out there that it's good, it's fine, because there's a worse thing that'll happen if you say no, it's terrible, we're about to burn, and like there are worse situations you can create.
Yeah, I mean, and as someone who's been in those rooms and tried to figure out what to say to people in times when the economy is falling apart, like March and April of 2020 were an interesting time to be in the room. I'll tell you that. And I like, you certainly try to be as honest as you can with folks, but also there's moments when you're on the precipice where it doesn't really do people good to know if you're on the precipice.
Yeah. No, yeah. It's like, it'll be worse. You're going to cause a cascading effect. Like, again, if for any chance there was one of those stocks, I don't remember which one it was again, that it would have turned around, if you would have said it's not, the next day everyone would have sold it, and then you definitely would have been
Yeah.
in much worse waters than if you had been honest and been like, we might not make it tomorrow. There's a very different situation. Same thing. If you're the CEO of a company, say like, we might not get funding in a month, which we'll need, and you might not have a job. Everyone quits.
Yeah,
Now you really have a problem, and you'll never get funding. And
That's
so
a
it's
good
like
way to get your burn down.
hey, hey, investor, our burn is like we can go on for the next good news. We can go on for the next year. Bad news, I'm the only employee.
We cut our head down to 4, but yeah.
So yeah, no, I think it's interesting. It's always fun to talk about I think high level topics. So thank you for indulging that a little bit. I guess like one more like kind of high level topic, and then maybe if anyone has some Q&A, you guys can start poking and posting. Yeah, I mean, like we kind of talked about, where's the data space going? Do you have any thoughts in terms of like where the data space is going? Let's say 5 years from now, not 10 years, because 10 years is just too long.
I mean, I think I am like kind of in a used to be stronger, but maybe fading a little bit, but still very much there belief that like some degree of consolidation is inevitable, where basically I think up until I would say probably 3-4 months ago, I very much was in the camp that data tooling will become the same as like cloud hosting. Yeah. That basically the big players will buy everything up. They will have their piece of it all. And ultimately customers will just decide like, which one are you on? Yeah. And I will buy all those pieces because I'd rather have the cohesive thing than have to pick and choose from a bunch of different stuff. And I think that's partly like because the products will work better together for the most part. I honestly think the bigger thing, especially when you start talking about like what enterprises are going to buy, is there's a procurement problem there. Like big companies are not going to buy 10 things from startups. They're just not going to do it. They're going to, if they have an option to buy it all from Google or Microsoft or Amazon or Snowflake, they're going to just go to Google and Microsoft, Amazon, Snowflake and buy it. Like they do not want to deal with, the CDO does not want to deal with all those contracts.
No.
I'm like a little maybe kind of softening on that, though. I think if it does happen, I think something like what Snowflake is doing is the way out. Yeah. Where you still basically buy a Snowflake platform, and in some ways you're still buying something from what looks kind of like a cloud provider, but you may buy these apps essentially that sit on top of it or in it that can be from different vendors, but they become kind of pre-approved. They become kinds of things where it's like less of a procurement problem. Because I do think there is in the sort of euphoria of what has been the data space for the last 18 months, which obviously is kind of coming to a bit of a crashing halt in the last 3. There has been a real neglect of the realities of the buyer and like the realities of just what big companies will actually deal with on that. We're like, great, not as just like named like, high touch and census and Monte Carlo and Big I and various data catalogs and data discovery tools and metrics tools and all of these things. They're great. They're good tools. If you're Coca-Cola, you're not like going out to buy one of all of them. It's like you just won't do it. And maybe like little teams will kind of throughout it, but like at some point, a enormous procurement arm that will like beat everybody down will show up and say like, no, this is not how we're going to go doing it. We have a Microsoft contract already that's $100 million. We're going to make it $103 million and replace all these other tools, and that's what you get. And like, I think that's kind of what has to happen. I think if Snowflake and this like app thing changes, I think that could be the case where like you buy Snowflake and then you get a bunch of apps sort of on top, or if you buy Databricks or whatever. So it may not be strictly the cloud providers, but it's just, maybe I'm wrong about this, but like, is there any other space that has even anywhere close to those number of buyers that you would actually buy? Like you could maybe make the case for like some software development tools where people will buy all these like little things, but they tend to be pretty small and inexpensive, and data tools are pretty pricey.
Yeah.
So
that's funny. It's like, why are they so expensive? But you're right. It's like, oh, you want like your data quality tool, $20,000 a year or something for these just for small companies. I think that's the other thing I've seen. It's like at large companies, when I'm like working with large companies, like you said, they're using Microsoft, they're using Informatica, they're using as much all in one as they can.
Mm-hmm.
If you go down market, like to smaller companies like SMBs, mid market, then you're going to see, Fivetran, Snowflake, companies that are a little more kind of pay per consumption, so it's often better for these companies. And then also they might be willing to manage maybe 6 contracts for some reason, which is weird. You'd think it'd be the opposite because there's no procurement to deal with.
And it's like someone can put in a credit card or whatever. And the other thing too, I think, and this is to your point of like, why are these things so expensive? I mean, I think that there is actually a little bit to me of that too. And the app thing maybe solves this, which is they're probably expensive because they're expensive to sell. Like, like the economics of a data product doesn't work if less the product is pretty expensive, because usually they're like costly to find customers. Procurement is usually kind of expensive because you have to go through security reviews and stuff like that. It can't be a thing where you're just like, yeah, fine, try it out right away. Like if you are something that's touching data, typically there's going to be some security and that sort of stuff review. Like they're often kind of hard to sell because they're like complicated, basically. Like you have to demo them. You have to go through like, there's a bunch of data products out there that you land on their website and it takes you a while to figure out what in the world they do. And like that whole thing basically requires a longer sales process. And so I think there is a fair amount of just like, in order to make the economics work, you can't sell these things for $3,000 a year. You have to sell them for something bigger than that. You can get around it by selling a bunch of seats. So if you're Tableau, you can sell a whole bunch of seats, and that's like pretty straightforward. You can maybe get around it by being like a Snowflake model where you just pay for usage. And like Fivetran probably did this reasonably well. Like somebody will do a small contract, it'll suddenly become an 80K contract kind of overnight. Segment, I think, actually is a company that did this very, very well, much to like customers' frustration, but hey, build a big business. But I think like a lot of these other things are kind of these in-between things that are sort of platform, like observability tools. It's a harder thing, I think, to make that work without selling a fairly big contract. And so I think like you kind of have to, and that really pushes you to like, I mean, it's very expensive to sell. That really pushes you to sell big contracts.
Yeah, no, that kind of makes sense in terms of like, it's just hard to do. All right, I'm gonna pull up.
But to that, before the questions up, to that point, I'd be interested. Like, you work with a lot of these folks. Like, kind of how you have probably a better perspective on some of this stuff than I do. Just like given the number of customers you work with, especially kind of up and down the market. Like, how do you see it?
Can you just what's this? Just define. Sorry.
Like where this is all headed.
I mean, like in terms of like data tooling, like obviously I think consolidation is going to happen just because, like you said, it's not worth it for companies to pay so much for products that just do one thing. I think that just becomes hard, and it just becomes another thing to manage. Like even as like someone who plays kind of this like solutions architect consultant, like having to now pick 5 or 6 products and go through the demo and the sales cycle for each of those is just so laborious. The more I can whittle that down, it's better for the customers as well. And it's just easier, I think, sometimes to sell because it's like, why do I need a data quality tool? Why do I need a data catalog tool? Becomes the question. And so if you can provide more out front, I think it's better. And I think, again, if it's like already built into Snowflake or something like that, I think that makes sense too, because then it's just like, it's all integrated. Because I think that's the other thing that's like missing. It's like, I have to go through like 6 surfaces to get all the information I need. When I'm like, why can't I just be in Snowflake and like go and see my data lineage? Like that's where I should be able to see it. Like I should be able to see where it's going. I should be able to see where it's coming from. I think that makes more sense than having to go, okay, now I go to Astronomer, or now I go to Fivetran, and Fivetran is just extract. It's not even, the transform layer. Now I got to go somewhere else for that if I didn't build it into Fivetran. And so you've got like so many places you have to go to, and then especially after being in Facebook, where it's like everything is integrated, like coming to a place where it's like nothing is integrated, even though it should all be integrated, is such a wild situation where it's like nothing talks to each other, so, or it sort of does.
And there's like an ugliness here to me. I like hope this doesn't happen, but it kind of feels like it probably is inevitable. Where there is some kind of ugliness that will happen among companies that are kind of friendly now. There's a lot, like you mentioned, the basically like Fivetran, observability, lineage, data discovery type of stuff, so like the Atlans of the world, things like DBT, which obviously has a lot of this information already in it. It's hard to see how these companies don't. And Mode's very much caught up in this too. So it's like by no means saying this isn't us too. But like reverse ETL and ETL, it's very hard to see how these companies don't. They have some big valuations they got to meet. They have some very big revenue targets they got to hit. They're selling relatively niche services. Like maybe they can get there, but like they're selling something that has to expand somehow. The market might be big enough to support it. So maybe the market just keeps blowing up and like you can actually build really big businesses on these small things because the market's so big. But it feels like the easy way that people actually see it is like, well, let's expand the surface area a little bit such that we start to really step on each other's toes. And I think there's a lot of these like kind of friendly partnerships where it's like, oh, you can put your lineage in Monte Carlo, but also it works great with DBT because there's lineage in that. But all of a sudden it's like, wait, we're both kind of selling the same thing. And we both also want to be a data catalog or whatever. And like, suddenly it becomes something where what I think people are sort of trying to avoid. There's a lot of like playing the Peter Thiel game of like, have no competitors. And I think that's like hard to maintain for that long.
Yeah, especially when like, you could argue that some things are features. So I think that's the thing. It's like how Apple like came out and was like destroyed like what was the joke? It's like 10 different like pillars in one day.
Yeah.
Like,
This happened a little bit in the Snowflake conference, honestly.
Yeah.
Snowflake Slootman got up and was like, we are a partner company. Okay, great, cool. And it's sort of sold that a little bit. But then they announced a bunch of stuff that was kind of like, that's the same product your partner built. And it wasn't like, there were ways in which you could spin it and it doesn't quite, it's not exactly what it is, but it is a little bit of like the Amazon launching a bunch of Amazon basics being like, no, we're not competitive with our sellers, but we also sell the exact same coat hangers for a third the price. You're like, well, damn.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, so we can, unless you have anything else, I can jump into Q&A.
I could stop the ranting.
No, there's so much ranting. And I don't know. I hope this one doesn't hit mode too close. But Ryan, I don't know if you know Ryan. I'm sure you probably. I think we were in the same room at one point. All of us. So he was asking, how can we utilize all this data in tooling besides building yet another dashboard? Has anyone like coined that term? It must have been coined, right?
Yet another dashboard. Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of yet another BI tools. First of all, dashboards are valuable, Ryan. So Mode is a company on which you can make dashboards, among other things. But yes. I mean, I think like there are genuine things I think that are moving in this direction. The reverse ETL deal certainly helps. I think things like, I'm hesitant to say data apps, but like there's a little bit of that sort of inject. Basically, the analogy I've used before on this is like Yelp, where I think a lot of like data apps, the way we think about data apps in a lot of cases is like, it's kind of a dashboard that's sort of blinged out. Like it's a dashboard with like widgets. I don't think that's a data app. I think Yelp is a data app. Like Yelp is a service that is essentially providing a bunch of data for you, but it doesn't feel like a dashboard in any way.
Yeah.
It's just a thing you cannot do without data. And so I can imagine there being lots of things like that are data that is injected more directly in like the problem you're trying to solve instead of, oh, I have a data app that's just a dashboard with some widgets. That said, the other thing here, this is like a whole other rant for some other time. There's actually this kind of like middle piece here that I feel like nobody does terribly well and is actually where we should be trying to get with all this, which is building models of a business. So really, to me, the thing that you actually want to be able to do is you want to be able to look at your business, understand how it's shaped, and kind of poke at it and be like, what happens if I do this? Okay, let's try that. Here's a bunch of stuff that changes around. And like going back to kind of the economic stuff, this is basically what economists do. And maybe not that well. It's a very complicated business that they're trying to understand. But basically all of it is built on these like theories of things like ISLM curves, which are basically like theories of how the economy works. And then you have data around it, but you can kind of like have this model of how the thing works. Businesses have that same thing too, but it's kind of much more like buried and implicit. So if you think about like a marketing funnel is this, if you think about the way that like growth loops and stuff work, they are this. But I really think like what we probably should be spending more time on, and this is like a kind of half-baked thought and will one day become a thing I probably yell about, is like, how do we better conceptualize what this business is and use data to not just build like charts that represent metrics, but use the data to see like what's actually happening and what is the shape of this business. And so a really good example of this, I think, is this is something like Facebook, I think, did. You can tell me. But Facebook basically has as I understood it, they had like a team that was focused on how do we get more people on Facebook? How do we get people to spend more time on Facebook? And how do we get people to like when it's basically more revenue per time spent on Facebook?
Yeah.
And like Google has something similar. It's basically like more searches, more revenue per search or whatever. I don't know. But there's these pieces where you can break the business down into these components. And once you do that, suddenly these problems become like much more tractable because you have this kind of model of how you actually make money.
Yeah.
And data teams, I feel like, are a little bit of a step away from that. I tend to focus on the metrics, which kind of lines up to that. Like, yes, that there's going to be a new user growth number. There's going to be like a retention number. There's going to be like some engagement number. But it doesn't quite have this like idea of if I like push on this string, what happens to this string over here? And so to me, that's really what this is about. Like really the holy grail in a lot of cases of what like data should become is I have a conceptual model of how my business works. And the data is the thing that like makes it real and makes me understand what's actually happening. And it's like, make it more like physics, basically. Okay, these are our theories for how the world works. And we measure all of it with this data. And then we can understand what might happen if we tweak those laws of physics.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like I'm trying to remember what article it was that I don't know if I always say like, I don't know if you know Lauren Bollick, but I'm like, you do. But like she sent me this article about like companies like breaking down like what's their smallest kind of unit that like makes the company money, essentially. Like what is the smallest thing you can think of, right? Like a post, on Facebook, like something of that nature. Because then once you think that way, then you can kind of think about like, okay, how do we then increase, like you said, those metrics, like time spent on Facebook? Well, people have to see the posts that they like at a rate that both maximizes profit, so there's some ads, but also at the same time keeps them attentive enough to each of those small units of posts over time that they're not going to leave immediately because they're like, oh god, there's too many ads. So trying to find that balance.
Yeah, and like finance teams do this really well. Financing, basically, they build it on Excel. Yeah. But financing have these big like Excel models of a business where if you want to put together like an annual plan, what a finance team will do is they'll go to open up with these models and be like, well, if we hire one fewer sales reps, this is what happens. And there's a bunch of stuff in that's like, the sales reps will sell less revenue, but they'll also have like things about the velocity of those deals. When does the revenue come in and when does it get recognized and how much money do we save on the expense? And like the whole business sort of shape shifts when you just change one of these things. And so like that to me, we don't really do that for other parts of the business. And you think like we could go much, much further. And that if you have that tool, like that's a enormously powerful thing. There was a thread, I think this was post Austin, and in the midst of a bunch of people being like, stop talking about tools. George Shing from Supergrain had this thread about this at Lyft, where Lyft basically built this model of how they understood the dynamics within a city. Of, okay, we add new drivers, we add new riders, we change pricing in this way, this is sort of how it shifts. And it started as apparently like a very simple thing. I think the thread has more details on it, but it started as a simple thing that kind of turned into this real robust model. And like that was how they made all of their decisions, was just like, let's see what the model tells us. Okay, if we change this, we change that. If we want to change this number, that's going to be the thing that has the biggest impact on how much money we make or whatever. If you have that, like you can do so much. And I feel like as a sort of industry, we aren't really thinking about that quite right.
Yeah, no, that Dan Carlito referenced Foundry because I know that, I don't know what you referenced Peter Thiel. So I know that's kind of what they're trying to do in terms of like entities and their ontology. It's like, these are the business model, which sometimes when I look at it, like I'm hopefully going to dig into it more, but sometimes I'm just like, that kind of sounds somewhat like a data warehouse. So you're just kind of breaking down things, but I'm curious to see kind of how that differentiates. All right. So speaking of tools, Brian was curious, how will no code tools affect DEs who write almost all SQL? I'm curious.
I don't know. I mean, this is it seems like data engineers aren't going to move that much in that direction. Like it feels like the sort of thing where my guess, and this is me like saying things that I don't really understand. My guess is that like a lot of data engineering work starts to look like DevOps, where you can do a lot of DevOps and sort of no code tools, but the whole thing renders to Terraform or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it feels like, and I know that there's a lot of work that people like Meltano are doing and stuff like that. I think there's like some real benefit to that, where it's sort of like push button data stack type of stuff, and the sort of thing that there's like versions of this. It's like what Metano does. There's versions of it that are like what Dagster does. These are all products that I can kind of like squint at, and I think I understand them, but I don't fully. They're like kind of technical tools that are over my head. Whether or not that all exactly is how it shakes out, I don't know. But my guess is it's the sort of thing that there's such a headache. And part of this is because there's so many tools, but it's such a headache to manage this thing. And such a just like you end up in such a spaghetti of nothing that makes sense when you're trying to figure it out that it seems like inevitably we will figure out some way to untangle it where it becomes easier for a data engineer to not be like, oh, I have this tool is routing to this tool is routing to this tool. There's some custom Airflow stuff that runs over here, but it's running Astronomer. And this other one is like, so the other person's running this Airflow thing on a local machine for some reason they've been doing for 3 years. We don't know why. And like all of it runs in some Snowflake job that's scheduled by DBT, but like the whole thing is just, you see the lineage of the thing and you're like, I cannot understand how anything comes out the other end that works. It's like the people always say like, when you get like, at least I've heard, I'm not this person, but the people who are like really good computer scientists are like, it doesn't make sense how any of this works. Like none of this should ever work. And yet it does. I kind of feel like that way when you get really deep into like a data stack, kind of like, none of this should ever make sense. But it feels like we will untangle that. It feels like that's kind of where it's going. The other way actually we probably kind of untangle it is it all lives in one place. So that again is the consolidation point where like, it's going to be really hard to do that if you have 8 tools. If it's all lives in Amazon or in Google and like Google does it, I mean, we've all seen like the GCP cloud console, so probably they don't figure it out either, but at least they have a better shot. Yeah. At least they have infinite money to try to figure it out.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing is like, I feel like no code tools have been around for me a long time, right? Like SSAS, how I could say has some code to it, but like it's an iteration. There's another tool called EasyMorph that I think has been around longer. And I feel like everything always reverts back to SQL. I mean, I think that's why DBT was so popular. Like you said, it's easy to understand, it's easy to implement, and basically people just became SQL literate very quickly, and then we're able to kind of pick it up. So yeah, I think there's going to always be, and I think data is getting more complex, and you have so many small one-off tools that there's always this need for code. Like I still have to write a lot of API connectors, even though there's hundreds of created ones. There's thousands of ones that people have not written that you will still have to write. It's just
yeah. And that, I think that there's 2 pieces of that to me that also I think make this really tough, which is data is really complicated and it has to be like expressive. So like I am generally bearish on like natural language data querying stuff. Mostly because you cannot, and if you ask somebody like in a business to ask a question, they cannot in plain English express what they're trying to get to. They're not like because they're idiots, but because it's like the example of like how many users do we have every week? What is a user? What is a week? Like what day? What time? All these things that people do not think to express. And so I think like having something that is no code that tries to abstract away these complexities basically is like you can't ask the question and anything less complicated than writing the code. Yeah. Somebody has to do that. And the other thing too is I think like there is this like slightly frustrating thing about data problems to me where they're 90% the same, but every business is like slightly different. And the slight difference is like the most important part. Where it's like the 3 custom fields you have in Salesforce are the 3 most important fields in Salesforce. Yeah. And so like you can't quite like, you can like almost copy and paste everything, but you can't really. And so I think that's where I get the code thing is just kind of inevitable.
Yeah. I think everything eventually just goes back to SQL and then eventually goes back to Excel. That's it's like first SQL then Excel. Let's see. So in terms of like, this is kind of more on the talent question. Do you perceive that there is a greater demand in the market for highly specialized data professionals or do it all data persons?
I would say, I'd be interested in your take on this, but I would say 100% the latter. Like the highly specialized folks, nobody hires that. Like if you're trying to get a job at Facebook at some very particular role or trying to get a job at Netflix is like, I want to be on this particular team that is solving this like streaming data capture problem for the sake of automatically like applying some ML to buffer quality, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Yeah. But so many people are basically in a position where, I mean, I would assume that actually a lot of the work that you do is because companies are like, we have a bunch of data problems and we need somebody who can come in and like solve all of them for us.
Yeah.
And so like somebody who's like, oh yeah, there's a problem. Now you need to spin up a database. I can help you with that. Oh, we actually have to answer the question. It's the thing that somebody's asking. I can help you with that. Like the generalist who is not afraid of these pieces kind of can work anywhere. Maybe they're less interesting to like a Netflix that has all these specialists, but I don't know. If you want the Netflix job, then you're basically trying to get like a very different job than the other one. But I would assume that, yeah, generally like someone who's kind of has a resume of lots of different things they can do is like pretty employable at a lot of places.
Yeah. I think I definitely think like there's like maybe like a T person, right? Like generally knows most things, but maybe specializes in one or two. Like a data engineer that's like good at like the data viz side is valuable because it goes back to like the why part. It's like, can you just build a pipeline, or can you like build a pipeline that then shows me the value of what I'm looking at this data, right? Like if you can do that, I think that just becomes all the more valuable to any company. And so maybe you come at it from a different perspective where it's like you're more of an analyst that like occasionally can build a data pipeline because they have to, because there's no one else at the company. But you're really good at telling the story. Or maybe you're a data engineer who's really good at building those pipelines, building tons of them, and then telling, at least a good enough story that, management can understand it. I definitely think it's personally more valuable. And I think even at companies like at Netflix and all this, like, actually, it's not, I think it's like almost the nature of the beast. It's like data is just such a broad thing. Like, even if you don't mean to, you end up becoming it. Like, yeah. It's like, oh, this is all I'm doing. And then suddenly it's like, well, now we're also, again, like 5 years ago, everyone was learning Hadoop. Now everyone's like learning something else, right? So you just become a generalist almost on accident, because like that is the field we're in. It is, although everything's around SQL mostly, it is somehow more complex than sometimes, or constantly changing, not complex, but constantly changing faster than almost front-end engineering. Because I think that's often the joke, right? Like, it's like front-end engineering is changing every year. It's like, have you been in data? Like,
yeah. And there's another part of that too, actually. So I may like revise my answer a little bit on this. If you're going to specialize, this isn't really this is kind of a cheat, but if you're going to specialize in something, I think there's actually like the thing that makes you really valuable is you're someone who understands like what the business is trying to do. And there's a lot of people, I think, in data that will kind of wait for the business problem to come to them. And if you're someone who doesn't do that, who's like, you have the capability of spinning up data pipelines, you have the capability of answering questions, you have the capability of making visualizations, but all of that is like, you understand how that's actually going to be applied to some problem somebody else has. People are like, oh my God, this is a thing I would love to have. And you showed me a thing I didn't know that I needed. Like if you could specialize, not really a specialty, but like, that is sort of always valuable, because basically what you're coming in is saying like, I have this tool set that I can apply to problems that will make your life better in some way. And I understand the problems that you have, so I can apply it. Yeah. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I having learned a little bit of like programming stuff, I would not consider myself an engineer in any way. I like can write a couple things to scrape websites and write Python scripts that count parking spaces. But having that ability in a job where it's not that common is huge. Like, you can suddenly do so many things that you didn't, like, nobody else can do. Like, oh, people are trying to like send out a bunch of emails. You're like, oh, I can automate that. Oh, I can do this stuff. Like, I can scrape a website and do all this stuff. Like, there's so many places where just like having that little bit of ability can be applied if you understand the things people are trying to solve. I think data is kind of the same way.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. I think yeah. All right. So next kind of question. So what do you think of cross-organizational data sharing and insight creation? Any solutions you've noticed that are interesting?
I mean, this is no. This is hard. I was talking to someone this was probably a month ago about BI. So Mode is a BI tool. And they were basically like, why isn't this solved yet? Why are we still building dashboards? And my answer to that is kind of like, because the problem is not a technology, like the problem is just a people problem. The problem is like the BI part is the part that goes from you have data to like somebody has to understand what to do with it. And that is fundamentally an unsolvable problem. Like, that's basically saying like, why is the problem of organizational alignment not solved? And it's like, because organizations just get misaligned. Like, is a bunch of people. We can't build a tool that solves organizational alignment. Like, it's a constantly kind of thing you have to deal with. And I think like this kind of stuff, like this collaborative element to it is, it's not really a tooling thing. Like it's just like people fight. People don't talk to each other. People don't understand what they're doing. Like people don't know what the person next to them is working on. You can have tooling that facilitates that and stuff, but ultimately, like you're just trying to help people do something that they're inherently not very good at.
Yeah.
And like for people generally, like nobody's good at this. Like it's just like we as humans are not good at these sorts of things. And so I think in some ways, like no, this isn't. There are people who are trying to do it. There are ways that like there's like sort of Atlans of the world that are trying to make stuff a little bit more discoverable. But fundamentally, I think it's like the job is to get something in my head into your head, and we've been trying to do that for millennia, and we're not good.
Yeah. And then occasionally, like we happen to fall on something that's like, oh, this was a good example of what to do. How do you do it? Hard to say. Like we just kind of like, this was just a one-off. Like, no,
Like,
I mean, there are some people who are good at it, but go ahead. Sorry.
Like Matrix, I know Kung Fu people, like, I don't know, we're going to struggle.
Yeah. No, I think that that's like, in a weird way, like I always tell people, like the tech is almost the easy part, right? Like it's the people and processes part that's like, how do we make sure people like talk about the right things at the right time? We have the right people working the right projects, that they're all communicating in such a way that it ends up to the right person and thus drives the right decision that then improves the business.
Yeah, and I'm stealing this from somebody. I don't remember who said this. It was in one of like the locally optimistic or DBT Slack. So if you're not in those things, go to that and you'll realize I stole everything. It was basically like they're saying there's a lot of tools that trade technology problems for people problems. They like seem like solutions, but in practice, what they're doing is just injecting a people problem. They're basically replacing a technology problem with a people problem. Where like we had this system that used to be something we would check manually, but when we figured it out, we knew exactly what to do. And now we have a system that checks it automatically. But when it does, it sends a bunch of alerts, and now these people have to coordinate about what to do about it. And almost universally, that's a bad trade-off. Like almost universally, like trading a technology, like saying we want more people problems and fewer technology problems is like, don't do that. Like fewer people problems, and you'll probably be better off. And so, yeah, I think there's that. Yeah. But anyway, about the thing about people problems, like, yeah, they're the hardest ones.
Yeah. I want to be mindful of time since it's almost 8:15. I don't know how much time you want to keep spending on this. There's still some questions. Let me know.
We can
keep going. All right. So only because I'm kind of curious. So your thoughts here, since you've been I think doing the business side a little more, as well as obviously analytics. But like, why does I assume product-led growth work for dev tooling but not data tooling?
That's a good question. My guess is a few things. My guess is one, because data teams are pretty small relative to dev teams. Like product-led growth basically implies you're selling bottoms up. You're able to kind of come in, build a thing that people like. It spreads somewhat virally, things like that. And to do that, you basically have to have a big enough. There has to be like a land and expand motion, essentially. Yeah. And data teams don't have that. Like they're just not that big. Sure, some of them are, but for the most part, like an engineering team is going to be much bigger than a data team. Like I don't know, how many engineers there are relative to data people, but I imagine it's a lot more. Yeah. That's probably one reason. My guess is that like engineers are a little bit more particular about their tools and a little bit more like pedantic about it. Like data people can be pretty pedantic, but not. Most data people aren't like dealing with Vim bindings. Like there are some, but it's not that common. Whereas like dev people are. There are some like viral elements. So Mode, for instance, Mode is a relatively viral tool. And the reason for that though is because it expands beyond the data team. It's like a data team comes to use it, they share it with everybody else in the company. So that can work. But the thing is, once you do that, once you're like outside of a team, you start to have to deal with procurement. You start to have to deal with like who owns the thing, who's paying for it. Like the data team doesn't want to pay for everybody's licenses. Yeah. If it's a small enough cost, they will. But if you're doing that at a big company, suddenly like you're dealing with a bunch of other things and stuff. And so I think it's just like a sort of a different buying cycle. There's a security element to it too, where data is a little like, I mean, dev tooling is probably pretty protected, but I'd say data tooling is probably more so. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, my guess is things like that, but I don't actually have it's a good question.
Yeah, no, that's I'm again for me. I feel like I only just woke up to more of like the general market maybe like a year and a half ago, because I was like, I'm just busy working, trying to like manage my consulting company while working at Facebook at the same time. So, and then suddenly I was like, oh, what's all this other stuff? Speaking about rooms, and then you suddenly just realize every time you step up one step, you're like, oh, there's so many levels to this game. What
It
where do
keeps
you want to stop? So yeah, let's see. Going back down, and just down to the more about data projects. Which of projects have you worked on that you kind of most enjoyed?
I think there's like two kind of classes of projects here. There's one. There are a few of these that both at Mode and Yammer actually that were the like something has gone wrong and you don't know why, and you're basically like the detective that's like what happened here. And there is something to me of like basically what you're looking for is like the satisfaction of figuring it out.
Yeah.
Half the time you never do. Half the time you're like, everything just kind of changed, which is frustrating. But there are sometimes you find like, and sometimes a lot, like half the time it's a data problem. It's like, oh, we did this thing in a particular way. Like one very particular example I can think of is back when I was at Yammer, we were doing like this A/B test. We did a bunch of A/B testing then. There was something that had like kind of a weird result that we couldn't figure out. That wasn't so weird to seem like it was wrong, but it was just like kind of everybody was it smelled funny. Spent a bunch of time figuring it out, trying to figure it out. And basically like what we realized was there was this bizarre behavior where a certain type of person was more likely to get treated into one group versus the other. Like the randomization actually, the way in which the randomization happened, just like, I don't even remember what it was, but like implied that actually certain types of people who would be more engaged in the product would be the ones in the test group. And I think it was something like when the experiment got flipped on, it sort of got triggered at certain times, and it got triggered at those times were off hours, such that the people who were on. It was like stuff like that. And it was like, I don't know, a very like rewarding thing to be like, we figured this out. So I did stuff like that. I enjoy the ones that kind of tell stories. I enjoy the projects where you can figure out like, hey, here's a narrative to tell. I mean, it's like, I don't know, the blog is basically me doing this on other stuff, but like, I obviously have some enjoyment out of that. And I think there's something to be said, and this is probably what this Friday will be, because it was going to be what last Friday was going to be, and the world fell apart. There is something I think to be said about a lot of analysts who are kind of actually engineers. And the thing that actually people like there is something fun about building a system that works. Yeah. There's something fun about like, oh, I created this data pipeline that's clean, that produces something nice out the other end, that I can read it, and it's all like neat and organized, and it's just like I built my little monument. And like I'm not an engineer, like I said, but there is this kind of like weird. Every once in a while, I like do something with a computer and I like run it and it works, and you just kind of smile at it and you're just like, wow, that worked. And like I feel like there's elements of that you can get from some of the more like data engineering, analytics engineering stuff, where you can like try a bunch of things and you push a button and like all of the little DBT jobs tick off green, and you're like, oh, I made it go.
Yes.
And so yeah, I don't know. That stuff could be fun in like a nerdy, weird way.
Yeah. No, I think I think it's kind of why I was drawn more towards this side than like data science. When I first started, it was like, oh, data science. And it's not to say you don't build systems in data science, but it's definitely not as geared towards it. So yeah, there's something to like, I built an entire system that goes end to end, and then this is the end result. Yeah. So what's happening this Friday? Am I not? Am I missing?
No, it was a blog post.
Oh, okay. I was like, what's happening this Friday? Am I missing something? Okay.
Yeah. 4th of July. Nobody should read it.
Yeah.
Do something else. Go barbecue or whatever.
Yeah. Let's see. So this next question, maybe it's more for me, but if you've got some insights, happy to do this. So, what do DEs do once they've built a relatively stable pipeline? What comes after model validation, historic snapshots for DE? I'm just curious.
As the person who uses it, we use it and we're happy. And I assume data engineers go home. I don't know. What do y'all do?
I mean, like, I think what generally happens is like you eventually start amassing a large number of data pipelines. Like I think at Facebook, I might have had a few, maybe 200-300 that were connected to me. And what happens is eventually things start to fail because software engineers change things. whatever bad data comes in, and then you spend the first hour of your day just being like, what pipelines failed today? None? Great. If some failed, let me go, kick them a little bit and see what's wrong. So I think that's sometimes what happens. It's like, it's just unavoidable. There's the next project. There's always like, I'm like working at Facebook, there was always the next thing. I always had like 3 things that I probably should have said yes to 1, and I said yes to 3. So I was always doing like, okay, what's the next thing on data that I gotta build, or next pipeline I gotta figure out, or person I gotta talk to fix some data. So there's always another thing. To me.
Yeah, and there's one thing I was gonna say. Is like, this is another thing I think that's a little bit of appealing about like the data engineering world, and this is probably not how it works in reality, because in practice, what you're doing is you're coming in and kicking data pipelines that broke for no reason. Building internal tools is kind of fun.
Yeah,
because like it's kind of the fun part. Like it's kind of the part where you don't have to deal with all like, I mean, it's like it has to be sort of production, but like when we were at Yammer, we built a lot of internal tools, and that's actually where like Mode basically came from. It was like an idea sort of spawned off from that. But a lot of it is just like looking around people you sit very close to. Your customers are right there, and you're like, what can I make that's going to be cool? And like, there's something very appealing to that to me too. Of like, we talk about this with like kind of our data engineers at Mode is like, oh, we need a thing that automatically does this and this. Can we make that? And you're kind of like, yeah. And, and like, I don't know, it's like, it's kind of a fun, just like go find problems and build stuff to make them better in a way that is a little bit less, it's less like sort of business oriented than production engineering. Like it's business oriented, and it very much helps the business, but it's less like, oh, we have to hit this metric. It's more just like, oh, here's a thing that would make everybody's lives better. I'm gonna go make it better.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, you use the example of Yammer, but that is like, speaking of all the startups that like came about in the last year and a half, it's like, that's where half of them came from. It's like, this person built this at Uber, and now they're like, what if I built it as a product? Or same thing like Trino is like, or not Trino, but Starburst, right? Like, it's like, oh, we built Presto. We want to build it for everyone. We want to build it for the enterprise, because, Facebook basically has to have a team that manages the enterprise factor, but for Presto, because it's like, Presto is great until you talk about security and all these other issues that it does not provide for. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the hard thing is that I tweeted this once. It's like, all engineers want to build tools that everyone wants to use and pay for. No engineer wants to pay for any tools that someone else wants to build. So it's always like hard to like sell to engineers, I feel like, because they're like, oh no, I'll just build it myself. You're like, yeah, you could. This makes sense.
There's a long list of Mode customers that were like, this seems like a chart on top of a SQL query. We can build that in a weekend. And they're like, yeah, you can. And they do. And like 2 weeks later, they're like, it needs to do 100 more things.
Yeah, actually, I was literally talking to someone who said that. They're like, it really only takes like a weekend or 2 to build like an F tier of all of these products, right? But then but then to build the next level, it's like, now we're talking about, $3 million, $10 million in funding, 2 years, and hope and a prayer that it all goes the right direction through your building, and you make all the right decisions on that path. I think we're pretty close to out of questions, but that makes me think. I was watching, I don't know if you ever watch Patrick Doyle. I think it's Patrick or Boyle. He's a YouTuber who talks about finance. He was talking about crypto, and he's like, yeah. So basically, over the last 3 years, all these crypto, startups have basically been speed running all of finance history and figuring out all the problems that people already figured out like forever ago. They're like, you guys are just kind of figuring out the same problems, just with a lot more money. And he's like. And the benefit of that, like, and I think he's right, is like and I don't know if he's joking because he has British dry humor, but the benefit of that is like, you might find new things that people didn't figure out the first time, which is true. But I think the same things kind of happen sometimes with data, where it's like, we're just like, let's just supercharge this whole area and figure out what we didn't maybe figure out right the first like 30 years of data, and maybe we can do it better. So
yeah, there is definitely an element of most of these blog posts that I've written of when I publish them being like, this feels like a thing that somebody's probably thought about for 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Somebody is certainly looking at this and being like, this clown thinks they have some new idea. Like, my God, we tried to do this at like IBM in 1983. Dude has no idea what he's talking about. They would be right, but still, yeah, there is a lot of that. And even with like this data app stuff, like all this Snowflake stuff, it's like, isn't that what Oracle did 20 years ago or 30 years ago? And it's like, yeah, I guess so.
But it wasn't on the cloud. So it's different.
Yeah, I mean, there's always like the one chain. It's like, oh, it's exactly that, but it's slightly different. And I think that still can matter. Like I do think there is. That's okay to me. Like I think that represents real progress in a lot of ways. And there are plenty of times when something you try it and it doesn't work, and you try it again 5 years later, and for some reason it works. And like, it doesn't seem necessarily wrong, but it's kind of funny that it's all like there are no new ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like the most humbling thing. You realize the older you get, you're just like, I mean, there's no new ideas. There's just maybe better execution, like, or right timing, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, it wasn't, Friendster, it was Facebook. Why? I mean, better business plan, right timing, whatever, like all the right details happen to hit off. So, I'm just curious. Ryan just commented something. Everything is the same, just more storage, network, compute. But yeah, it's there's not a lot of new, again, just a lot of better execution or right timing. I don't know. That's why whenever anyone's like, you want to do a startup, like some people have asked me that, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like all the ideas are there, and I don't know if I'd execute better. So until I have an idea that I'm like, this needs to be built, I don't know if I'm going to jump in there. But maybe you just got to do it. But I'm just like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even if they haven't exact. So this is like a thing that I still, when Mo got started, basically we're trying to start a blog. This blog we're trying to start, the one about all the weird stuff. It eventually moved to like a mode.com property, but it started with there were two blogging platforms that were like exactly the same at that point. There was Medium, and there was one called Subtle. But
I don't even know this one.
Yeah, exactly. It was the exact same thing. Like it was like, oh, it's going to be a blog that you like edit on it. It'll look nice. It had this little thing called Kudos, where if you hovered over it, it had this cool little animation. It would like pop. And so for that reason, I'm choosing Subtle. It was not a good choice. It did not win, but it was like, it's the exact same thing as Medium. And so like, why did one win and one didn't? I mean, I guess the Medium wins like kind of, but like certainly, short term they did. So yeah, I don't know. It's a million things that go into it, and yeah, BennStancil.com might actually point to this Subtle blog. Oh, it does. Still up. Okay. Yeah.
It's funny. I have thoughts on Medium. There's a reason I switched to Substack. I was like, you guys finally added an email like capture. Like this should have been a feature like 5 years ago when I started, but I get it, but
I'm shocked that this still exists. It blows me away.
Medium or
Subtle?
Oh, okay. Oh, you're you're just over here in fascination that your blog still exists.
Yeah. Here's how to create 100,000 parking spots in San Francisco.
There you go. Awesome.
It's still there. Still live. Hope you give it kudos.
Nice. I'll have to go look that up. All right. Well, it is 8:30. I don't want to take too long. So, and I think most of the questions have slowed down at this point. So, the paywall is disgusting. I don't know if he means for me. Someone just commented the paywall is disgusting.
Paywall on Subtle.
I don't know if it's for Subtle or for Medium.
Medium paywall is pretty annoying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and they don't like you don't get paid as well as you think. I have people who like, and when I first started on Medium, I was like, oh my god, this is going to be a great way to make a boatload extra income, because one of my articles made like $5,000, and I was like, dude, this is it.
Easy.
And then you realize how hard it is to keep doing that, and it's like, no, this is you've got to you've just got to do it over and over and over again, and it's too hard.
How does Medium pay? Is it they pay based on like likes or whatever? Like each one sort of.
They went through a few iterations. I think now it's just spent it's like a combination of like time per post, but also based on the fact that, okay, the person spent $5. That $5 goes into a pot. They then split that based on like time per that user per different post. So I think if they spend more time on someone else's blog, they get a little bit more of that, like maybe like $2.50, whatever they split between you and the actual company. It used to be based on like claps and things like that, and they went through a few different types there, but yeah. And again, like I was like $5,000. Like imagine if you made $5,000 an article, you put out like 4 articles. Like
amazing. Mo can go do their own thing. I got a new job.
But yeah, that was like a one-time thing, and it was like, yeah, all right, this is not my life. Anyways, I don't want to take too much of your time. I really appreciate all your answers, and you have I like that you've been doing this for a while, both from like an analytics side, also from a startup side. So I don't know if you have any questions for me before we kind of sign off, but
I don't know. What did I miss? What are interesting things that we didn't talk about?
we talked about a lot of things. I don't, like we could be here all night. Like the first time or the second time I did this, I was here for like 3 hours and I didn't realize it. So we could be here all night. I'm sure you have things to do, and I appreciate your time. And if you
Yeah,
got
for
anything
sure.
else, I can say goodbye to everyone. I can hit end broadcast. Thanks all for watching. I'm gonna hit end broadcast so we can,